The rifle shot sent dust flying from the wooden post 6 inches to the right of Hope Miller's head. But she didn't flinch. Her future depended on standing perfectly still as the town of Copper Springs watched with bated breath. It was April 1875, and 22-year-old Hope had never imagined her life would come to this. A mail-order bride nobody wanted. "Last chance," Sheriff Burke called out, his voice carrying across the town square. "This here mail-order bride needs a husband or she'll be sent back east on tomorrow's stage. Her intended has passed, God rest his soul, but the fare's been paid. Any man here willing to take her as his lawful wife?" Hope's cheeks burned with humiliation. 2 weeks ago, she'd stepped off the stagecoach wearing her best dress, clutching a letter from Walter Jenkins, a shopkeeper who'd promised her a good home and a respectable life far from the crowded tenements of Boston. Instead, she'd found the town in mourning. Walter had died 3 days before her arrival, trampled by his own spooked horse. The townspeople had been kind enough, putting her up at the boarding house while they sorted things out. This public auction was their solution. Hope stared straight ahead, refusing to meet the eyes of the curious onlookers. Most of the men shuffled their feet, looking anywhere but at her. She wasn't unattractive with chestnut hair and clear blue eyes, but taking a stranger as a wife was a risk few seemed willing to accept. No takers. Sheriff Burke asked, scanning the crowd. "She can cook, clean, and comes with a small dowry from her late father." A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Hope felt her heart sinking. The alternative to finding a husband meant returning to Boston in disgrace, to the leering cousin who had made her life unbearable after her parents died. "Nobody," the sheriff sighed. "Well then, Miss Miller, I reckon she's mine." The deep voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Hope turned to see a tall man stepping forward from the back of the gathering. Dust covered his clothes, and his face was partially obscured by a week's worth of beard, but his eyes, green as summer grass, locked onto hers with unexpected intensity. "She's mine," he repeated, more firmly this time. "Forever." The crowd parted as he strode forward. Hope felt her breath catch in her throat. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work and harder decisions. "And who might you be, mister?" Sheriff Burke asked, eyeing the stranger skeptically. "Garrett Lawson." He removed his hat, revealing thick sandy hair in need of a trim. "I have a cattle ranch 10 miles north, been meaning to find myself a wife." His eyes never left Hope's face. "Seems like today's the day." Hope studied him carefully. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the Eastern gentleman she'd known, but there was something compelling about his weathered face. He looked to be about 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun rather than from laughter. "Miss Miller." Sheriff Burke turned to her. "Do you accept Mr. Lawson's proposal?" Hope hesitated. Marrying a complete stranger hadn't been her plan, but then again, Walter Jenkins had been little more than words on paper. At least this man had the courage to claim her when no one else would. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I accept." A cheer went up from the crowd, more from relief than celebration. The town's problem had been solved. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife," Sheriff Burke declared, clearly eager to conclude the matter. "You can make it official with Preacher Wilson tomorrow, but this'll do for now." Garrett Lawson nodded once, then approached Hope. Up close, she could smell leather, horse, and the open prairie on him. "Got your things?" he asked quietly. "At the boarding house," she replied. "Let's get them then." He offered his arm, surprisingly formal for a man who looked like he'd just ridden in from the wilderness. Hope took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt sleeve. As they walked through town, she was acutely aware of the stares following them. She'd just married a man she didn't know, who had appeared from nowhere to claim her. But whether he was her savior or something else entirely remained to be seen. The small room at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house contained everything Hope owned in the world: one trunk of clothes, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a small wooden box of sewing supplies. That's all. Garrett asked, lifting the trunk with ease. Yes, Hope replied, clutching her Bible and sewing box. I travel light. Something like approval flickered across his face. Good, long ride ahead. Hope followed him outside where a sturdy bay gelding waited. Garrett secured her trunk behind the saddle with practiced efficiency. Can you ride? He asked. Not really. In Boston, I mostly walked or took streetcars. He nodded as though he'd expected this answer. You'll ride with me then. I'll come back for supplies tomorrow. Before she could respond, he'd lifted her onto the horse and swung up behind her, his chest pressed against her back, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. Hope sat rigid, unused to such close contact with a man. Relax, he murmured near her ear. Horse can feel your tension. Hope tried to loosen her posture, but the unfamiliar intimacy made it difficult. As they rode out of town, she caught a few women watching with expressions that mingled pity with curiosity. She lifted her chin and looked ahead. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the rhythmic movement of the horse eventually lulling Hope into a state of uneasy acceptance. The landscape opened before them, rolling hills dotted with pine trees, wildflowers splashing color across meadows. In other circumstances, she might have found it beautiful. Why did you do it? She finally asked, breaking the silence. Garrett didn't immediately answer, and for a moment Hope thought he might ignore her question entirely. Needed a wife, he said eventually. Saw an opportunity. Is that all I am? An opportunity? His chest rumbled with what might have been a suppressed laugh. You asking if I'm some kind of scoundrel, Miss Miller? Mrs. Lawson, apparently, she corrected, surprising herself with her boldness. This time he did chuckle, a low sound that she felt rather than heard. Fair point. No, I'm not a scoundrel. I need help with the ranch. Been running it alone since my pa died last winter. And, he paused. No woman should be humiliated like that. Standing there while men decide if you're worth claiming. Hope hadn't expected such insight from him. Thank you for that, at least. Don't thank me yet. Ranch life is hard. Might find yourself wishing I'd left you to the stage. I doubt that, she said quietly, thinking of what awaited her back east. They crested a hill and Garrett pulled the horse to a stop. Before them lay a valley with a modest ranch house, a large barn, corrals, and rolling pastures where cattle grazed. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. Lawson Ranch, Garrett said, a note of pride in his voice. Not much compared to some, but it's mine. Ours now, I suppose. Hope studied what was to be her new home. The house was simple but solid, with a porch wrapping around two sides. Smoke rose from the chimney. You have help? She asked, surprised. Old Jim. Cooks, keeps an eye on things when I'm gone. He was my pa's friend, lives in the small cabin behind the main house. They continued down the hill, and as they approached, Hope saw an elderly man emerge onto the porch. He watched their arrival with undisguised curiosity. Brought home more than supplies, I see, Jim called as they rode into the yard. Garrett dismounted first, then reached up to help Hope down. Her legs felt wobbly after the long ride, and she gripped his arms to steady herself. For a moment they stood close, and Hope caught a better look at his face without the shadow of his hat. His eyes were even greener up close, with flecks of gold near the pupils. Jim, this is Hope, Garrett said, stepping back. My wife. The old man's bushy eyebrows shot up in surprise. Wife, when did this happen? About 3 hours ago, Garrett replied matter-of-factly. She was Walter Jenkins' mail-order bride. He died before she arrived. Jim's weathered face softened as he looked at Hope. Poor girl. Well, you've landed on your feet, even if this one doesn't know the first thing about treating a lady. He shot Garrett a disapproving look. Bringing her home without warning, not even a proper wedding. Sheriff Burke married us, Garrett said defensively. That's not a wedding, that's a formality, Jim scoffed. He tipped his hat to Hope. Welcome to Lawson Ranch, Mrs. Lawson. I've got stew on and there's fresh bread. You must be hungry after your ordeal. Hope smiled gratefully. Thank you, Jim, and please call me Hope. Jim led them inside, where Hope discovered the interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace, a solid wooden table with chairs, and a pair of well-worn armchairs. Doorways led to what she presumed were bedrooms. "It's not fancy," Garrett said, watching her take in her surroundings, "but it's solid, no leaks even in the worst storms." "It's lovely," Hope said sincerely. After the cramped tenement in Boston, the spaciousness felt luxurious. Jim served the stew, which was hearty and flavorful. Hope ate hungrily, realizing she hadn't had a proper meal all day. As they ate, Jim carried the conversation, telling stories about the ranch and asking Hope polite questions about Boston. Garrett said little, but Hope occasionally caught him watching her with an unreadable expression. After dinner, Jim excused himself to his cabin, leaving Hope alone with her new husband for the first time. An awkward silence fell between them. "I'll show you where you can sleep," Garrett finally said, rising from the table. He led her to a bedroom at the back of the house. It was simply furnished with a bed, dresser, and washstand. The bed was neatly made with a colorful quilt. "This was my mother's sewing room," he explained. "Made it into a guest room after she passed. Never had guests, though." He hesitated at the doorway. "I'll sleep in the barn until we figure things out." Hope turned to him, surprised. "The barn? But you don't have to, I do," he interrupted firmly. "We're strangers who happen to get married today. That doesn't make us." He trailed off, color rising in his face. "Anyway, get some rest. Tomorrow we'll come early." Before she could respond, he'd gone, leaving Hope alone with her thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd been facing public humiliation and a return to Boston. Now she was the wife of a cattle rancher, living miles from the nearest town. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small closet and placing her mother's Bible on the bedside table. The events of the day caught up with her, and exhaustion washed over her in a wave. Hope changed into her nightgown, slipped beneath the quilt, and despite her tumultuous thoughts, fell into a deep sleep. True to Garrett's word, morning came early. Hope woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress, pinned up her hair, and went to the kitchen where she found Jim cooking breakfast. "Good morning, Hope," he greeted her cheerfully. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," she looked around. "Where's Garrett? Been up since before dawn." Spring calving season, busiest time of year. He's checking on a heifer that's about to deliver. Jim placed a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her. "Eat up. Then I'll show you around if you like." Hope appreciated Jim's kindness. After breakfast, he gave her a tour of the ranch house, explaining how things worked: the pump for water, the root cellar where they stored food, the woodpile that needed constant replenishing. "Garrett's a good man," Jim told her as they walked back toward the house. "His bark is worse than his bite. Lost his ma when he was 12, and his pa was a hard man, not mean, just weathered by life. Didn't teach the boy much about women or feelings." Hope nodded, understanding more about her husband's reticence. "How long have you known him?" "Since he was born." "Helped deliver him, in fact. His pa and I came west together in '42 before the big gold rush. We were more brothers than friends." Jim's eyes grew distant with memory. "I never married, never had children of my own. Garrett's the closest thing to a son I've got." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats. Garrett rode in, leading a second horse laden with supplies. He dismounted, nodding to Hope. "Heifer and calf doing fine," he reported to Jim. "Good. Hope and I were just getting acquainted," Jim replied. "I'll put these supplies away while you two talk." Jim took the second horse and led it toward the barn, leaving Hope and Garrett standing in awkward silence once again. "Did you sleep well?" Garrett finally asked. "Yes, thank you. The bed is very comfortable," he nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good. I brought some things from town. Flour, sugar, coffee, and this." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might like it." Hope took the package, surprised by the gesture. She unwrapped it to find a hairbrush with a silver handle, simple but elegant. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched. Noticed you didn't have much, he said, shrugging as if embarrassed by his thoughtfulness. Woman at the general store helped me pick it. Thank you. Hope ran her fingers over the silver handle. It was the first gift she'd received in years. Garrett cleared his throat. There's work to be done, feel free to. Well, make yourself at home, I suppose. It is your home now. He turned to go, but Hope called after him. Garrett. I can cook dinner tonight to thank you and Jim for your kindness. He looked back, surprise evident on his face. You don't have to do that. I want to, she insisted. I'm a good cook. It's one way I can contribute. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she'd seen from him. All right then. Jim will appreciate the break. Hope spent the day exploring her new home more thoroughly. She took inventory of the kitchen supplies, finding them adequate but basic. The house was clean, but had the unmistakable feel of a place inhabited only by men functional, but lacking the small touches that made a house a home. By late afternoon, Hope had prepared a hearty beef stew with dumplings, using some of the fresh vegetables Garrett had brought from town. When the men came in for dinner, tired and hungry, the table was set, and the aroma of good food filled the house. Smells wonderful, Jim said appreciatively, washing his hands at the basin. Garrett sniffed the air and nodded in agreement. Looks like I made a good choice at that auction after all, he said, the hint of a joke in his voice. Hope served the stew, and the men ate with obvious enjoyment. For the first time since arriving, Hope felt a sense of purpose and belonging. This was something she could do, create a comfortable home for these hard-working men. As they ate, Garrett surprised her by asking questions about her life in Boston. Hope told them about growing up as the daughter of a bookkeeper, losing both parents to influenza 3 years ago, and going to live with her mother's cousin who had made it clear she was an unwelcome burden. Is that why you answered Walter Jenkins' advertisement? Jim asked. Hope nodded. My cousin was arranging a marriage for me to a business associate of his, a widower with 5 children and a wandering eye. Walter's letter offered a respectable alternative. Brave of you, Garrett commented, coming all this way to marry a stranger. No braver than claiming a stranger for a wife, Hope countered with a small smile. Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, respect, perhaps. Touché, Mrs. Lawson. In the days that followed, Hope and Garrett established a cautious routine. He worked from dawn until dusk with the cattle, occasionally assisted by 2 hired hands who lived in town but came out for the busiest times. Hope took over the cooking and household duties, freeing Jim to help more with the ranch work. She found she enjoyed the rhythm of ranch life. The physical labor was hard but satisfying, and the open spaces and fresh air were a welcome change from the crowded city. Each evening, she prepared dinner, and the 3 of them would eat together, sharing the events of their day. Gradually, Garrett began to open up more. Hope learned that he had inherited the ranch 5 months ago when his father died of pneumonia. Before that, he had worked alongside his father since he was a boy, learning every aspect of cattle ranching. His mother had been a schoolteacher from St. Louis who had followed her heart west and never regretted it, despite the hardships. She taught me to read and write, to cipher, and to appreciate beauty where you find it, Garrett told Hope one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. Jim had already retired to his cabin, leaving them alone in the gathering twilight. She sounds wonderful, Hope said, imagining the woman who had created the colorful quilt on her bed. She was. Garrett's voice softened with memory. Would have liked you, I think. She always said a house needed a woman's touch. He glanced at the flower seeds Hope had planted along the edge of the porch. Already looks more like a home than it has in years. Hope felt a warm glow at his words. Thank you for giving me a chance to make it one. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Then Garrett looked away up at the emerging stars. Got an early start tomorrow, he said, standing abruptly. Good night, Hope. Good night, Garrett. She watched him walk toward the barn, where he still insisted on sleeping despite her offers to make other arrangements. Hope wasn't sure if she was relieved or disappointed by his continued distance. Spring gave way to early summer, bringing longer days and more work. Hope had settled into her role on the ranch, expanding her duties to include tending a vegetable garden and helping with some of the lighter ranch work. She had even learned to ride, with Garrett patiently teaching her on his gentlest mare. One afternoon, a fierce thunderstorm blew in from the mountains. Hope had just finished hanging laundry when the first fat raindrops began to fall. She hurried to gather the clothes, but the wind whipped them from her hands. Suddenly, Garrett was there beside her, helping collect the flapping sheets. They ran to the porch just as the heavens opened in earnest. Standing under the roof's protection, they watched the deluge, both slightly breathless and damp from their dash. "That came on fast," Hope remarked, wringing water from a shirt. "Mountain storms always do," Garrett replied. He reached out and tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear, the gesture so casual and intimate that Hope's breath caught. "Got water in your eyes," he murmured, his fingers lingering near her cheek. Hope looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Raindrops clung to his eyelashes and his normally serious face had softened. For a moment, she thought he might lean down and kiss her, but the slam of the barn door broke the spell as Jim hurried toward the house, hunched against the rain. The moment passed, but something had changed between them. Hope caught Garrett watching her more often, and there was a new awareness in his gaze. For her part, she found herself noticing small things about him, the way the sun brought out gold highlights in his hair, how his hands were rough but always gentle, the rare but transformative effect of his smile. A week after the rainstorm, Garrett announced at breakfast that he needed to ride into town for supplies. "Would you like to come?" he asked Hope. "Might be nice for you to get off the ranch for a day." Hope agreed eagerly, both for the change of scenery and for the opportunity to spend time with Garrett away from the daily work of the ranch. They set out after breakfast, riding double on Garrett's horse. Hope had grown accustomed to the close contact, but today she was especially aware of his arms around her, the solid strength of his chest against her back. Copper Springs looked different to Hope now that she'd been away from it for nearly 2 months. The town seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating. As they rode down the main street, people called out greetings to Garrett, looking curiously at Hope. "Word travels fast in small towns," Garrett murmured near her ear. "Everyone will be wanting to meet Mrs. Lawson properly." Sure enough, as they tied the horse outside the general store, several women approached, introducing themselves and welcoming Hope to the community. They were friendlier than she had expected, inviting her to join the ladies' sewing circle that met weekly. Inside the store, Mr. Peterson greeted them warmly. "Mrs. Lawson, good to see you again under better circumstances." Hope smiled, remembering the kind storekeeper who had helped her during her first difficult days in town. "It's good to see you too, Mr. Peterson." "Garrett treating you right out there at the ranch?" he asked with a wink. "Yes, very well," Hope replied truthfully. Garrett looked pleased at her response as he handed Mr. Peterson his supply list. While the storekeeper gathered their items, Garrett led Hope to a display of fabric. "Thought you might want to pick out something," he said, "for curtains or whatever women use fabric for." Hope ran her fingers over a bolt of cheerful yellow calico. "This would make lovely curtains for the kitchen windows." "Take as much as you need," Garrett said. "And anything else that catches your eye." By the time they finished their shopping, they had accumulated a considerable pile of supplies, not just the usual staples, but fabric, thread, a new kettle to replace the leaky one, and even a book of poetry that Hope had admired. "We should celebrate being in town," Garrett suggested as they loaded their purchases. "Have dinner at the hotel before heading back." The hotel dining room was the fanciest establishment in Copper Springs, and Hope happily agreed. They secured their supplies and walked to the hotel, Garrett's hand resting lightly on the small of Hope's back. The dining room was busy, but the proprietor, Mrs. Hollister, immediately showed them to a table by the window. "So nice to see you too," she said warmly. "We've all been wondering how you were getting along." As they ate, Hope noticed the curious glances from other diners. "Everyone's staring," she whispered to Garrett. "Small town," he replied with a shrug. "Not every day a confirmed bachelor like me shows up with a beautiful wife." Hope blushed at the compliment. "Is that what you were, a confirmed bachelor, according to town gossip?" He smiled ruefully. "Truth is, I was too busy with the ranch to court anyone properly. And the local girls weren't exactly lining up to live 10 miles from town with a man who spends more time with cattle than people." "Their loss," Hope said boldly, surprising herself. Garrett's eyes warmed. "Definitely my gain." The ride home was quiet but comfortable, the silence between them no longer awkward but filled with unspoken understanding. As they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, Garrett pulled the horse to a stop, just as he had on Hope's first day. "Looks different now, doesn't it?" he asked. Hope studied the ranch below. In the golden evening light, it looked peaceful and welcoming. The vegetable garden she'd planted was thriving and flowers bloomed along the porch. Smoke rose from the chimney where Jim would be preparing dinner. "It looks like home," she said softly. Garrett's arms tightened around her briefly. "That's your doing." When they arrived at the ranch, Jim helped unload their supplies, exclaiming over the new kettle and fabric. After dinner, he retired early, claiming fatigue, though Hope suspected he was giving them privacy. Hope was sorting through her sewing supplies when Garrett appeared in the doorway of the sitting room. He'd clearly just washed up, his hair was damp, and he'd changed into a clean shirt. "I have something for you," he said, seeming uncharacteristically nervous. He held out a small box. "Got it in town today while you were talking with the ladies." Hope opened the box to find a delicate silver ring with a small pearl. "Garrett," she breathed, "it's beautiful." "Thought you should have a proper wedding ring," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "If you want it, that is." Hope looked up at him, her heart racing. "I do want it." Garrett took the ring and slid it onto her finger, his calloused hands gentle. "There's something else I want to say," he began, still holding her hand. "When I claimed you that day, it was partly because no woman deserves to be humiliated like that, and partly because I did need help with the ranch." Hope nodded, waiting for him to continue. "But these past weeks..." He paused, searching for words. "You've brought life back to this place. To me." His green eyes met hers, vulnerable and sincere. "I want this to be a real marriage, Hope, if you'll have me." Hope's heart soared. She'd been falling in love with this quiet, honorable man day by day, never certain if he felt the same. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. Garrett's face transformed with a smile so bright it took her breath away. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she responded eagerly. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you," he murmured, "I've never been much good with words or showing feelings." Hope smiled, touching his cheek. "You're doing fine so far." That night, Garrett didn't go to the barn. Instead, he moved his few belongings into the main bedroom, which they would now share as husband and wife. As summer progressed into fall, their love deepened. Hope discovered that beneath Garrett's reserved exterior was a man of deep feeling and unexpected tenderness. For his part, Garrett marveled at Hope's strength and resilience, her ability to transform a simple ranch into a true home. In October, they held a proper wedding ceremony in the town church, with Jim standing as Garrett's best man and Mrs. Peterson as Hope's matron of honor. The entire town turned out to celebrate, many admitting they'd had doubts about the hasty marriage. "Never seen Lawson smile so much," Sheriff Burke commented to Jim during the reception. "You'd think he'd won the biggest prize at the county fair." "He did," Jim replied, watching the newlyweds dance. "He most certainly did." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Garrett took Hope's hand. "Remember when you asked why I claimed you that day," he said. Hope nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "You said you needed a wife." "I did, but there was something else." He turned to face her. "When I rode into town that day, I saw you standing there so brave and dignified despite everything. Something just clicked." He shook his head, still seeming amazed. I knew I couldn't let you go. And here I thought it was my cooking that won you over, Hope teased gently. Garrett laughed, pulling her closer. That came later, though I'm not complaining. Hope nestled into his embrace, thinking of how far they'd come from that day in the town square, strangers, bound by desperate circumstances, who had found true love against all odds. I'm glad you claimed me, she murmured. Best decision I ever made, Garrett replied, his voice husky with emotion. You truly are mine forever, Hope Lawson, and I am entirely yours. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sealed this promise with a kiss, certain that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, no longer strangers but partners in every sense of the word. The following spring, as wildflowers once again carpeted the meadows around Lawson Ranch, Hope gave birth to their first child, a daughter with her father's green eyes and her mother's determination. They named her Emma, after Garrett's mother, and as Garrett held his tiny daughter for the first time, the last walls around his heart crumbled completely. My family, he whispered, looking from his daughter to his wife with wonder in his eyes. My forever.